My name is Rhea Thompson. I'm 32 years old, and the cruelest words I ever heard came from my own father. One night, after another endless comparison, he looked straight at me and said, "Rhea, you will never be as good as your brother." I remember my chest tightening, my hands shaking under the table. For years, I had begged for their approval, and in that single sentence, he carved the truth I had always feared. Growing up, I wasn't just a daughter. I was a shadow trailing behind Ethan, the perfect child. Every teacher, every neighbor, every relative had something to praise about him. And when their eyes turned to me, I saw pity instead of pride. No matter how hard I tried, I was never enough. But here's the part they never expected. That cruel sentence didn't destroy me. It woke me up. It became the spark that pushed me to fight for a life beyond their judgment. And when they came back years later, asking for more from me, I finally had the courage to answer with 7 words that changed everything. Then ask him to pay the bills. Have you ever felt like no matter what you did, it was never enough? If you've lived in the shadow of a perfect sibling, you know that pain too well. Hit like if you've ever carried that weight. Subscribe if you believe everyone deserves to be seen for who they are, and drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know I'm not alone. From the outside, we looked perfect. But inside, only Ethan shined. Every win of his was a celebration. Every effort of mine was dismissed. To them, he was the golden child. And I was just Rhea. Never enough. From as far back as I can remember, every moment of my childhood was measured against Ethan's accomplishments. It didn't matter if I worked hard or poured my heart into something, because the first thing out of my parents' mouths was always his name. When I came home one afternoon clutching a ribbon from a local art contest, my chest bursting with pride, I laid it gently on the kitchen counter, waiting for my father to notice. He picked it up, glanced at it for barely 2 seconds, and said, "That's nice, but do you remember when Ethan won the regional debate finals?" That was something we'll never forget. The joy that had been swelling inside me collapsed in an instant, and I quietly folded the ribbon back into my bag. School didn't feel much different. Teachers who adored Ethan seemed to expect me to be his duplicate, and when I wasn't, disappointment clouded their faces. In math, I struggled through algebra problems while Ethan had breezed through with perfect scores. I can still hear my mother sighing as she said, "Your brother never needed extra help in math. Why can't you be more like him?" It wasn't a question. It was a judgment. Every report card became another battlefield, and every grade I earned felt less like a reflection of my work and more like evidence of how far I fell short of their expectations. Even ordinary family dinners turned into stages for comparison. We would sit down to eat, and the conversation would drift toward Ethan's latest achievement. Another trophy, another A, another moment of brilliance. I would try to speak about something that had happened in my day, but within seconds, the topic would circle back to Ethan. I learned to stop trying, to swallow my words with each bite of food, and retreat into silence. Sitting at that table, I wasn't a daughter sharing a meal with her family. I was an audience member in Ethan's show. The comparisons didn't just make me feel invisible. They planted a seed of doubt inside me that grew bigger with each passing year. I began to wonder if there was anything I could ever do that would matter to them. I practiced piano late into the night, my fingers aching, hoping to impress them. When I performed at a recital and played a Mozart piece I had worked on for months, my mother leaned over afterward and whispered, "Ethan had mastered Chopin by your age." I smiled politely, but inside I felt my effort crumbling into dust. By the time I entered high school, I had stopped competing for their approval. It was a race I knew I could never win. Ethan was always several steps ahead, no matter how hard I tried to catch up. The comparisons had turned into a wall I couldn't break through, so I turned away from it completely. Instead of trying to outshine him in their eyes, I began searching for a light of my own. By the time I had grown used to being overlooked at home, I thought maybe family gatherings would feel different. At least with a room full of people, I hoped someone would see me for who I was. But every holiday proved me wrong. Thanksgiving was the worst. The house would fill with relatives carrying pies and casseroles. The table would be crowded with food, and the conversation always found its way back to Ethan. I remember one year especially well. I had just won first place in a regional art competition for a watercolor painting that I had poured my whole heart into. I brought a copy of it to show my relatives, secretly hoping this time someone would say they were proud of me. At first, I sat quietly while everyone asked Ethan about his new internship at a law firm. He was surrounded by admiration, each compliment stacking higher like another trophy on his shelf. Then, finally, someone turned to me. My aunt smiled politely and asked, "And what about you, Rhea? Still drawing those little pictures?" The words were soft, but they carried the sting of dismissal. My cheeks burned as I nodded, unable to defend myself, and I folded the copy of my painting back into my bag before anyone could see it. As if that wasn't enough, my grandmother Margaret, who had always adored Ethan, decided to add her thoughts for everyone to hear. She lifted her glass and said, "Ethan will make this family proud for generations. He's destined for greatness. Rhea has her hobbies, but he is the one who will carry our name forward." The room erupted in cheers for him, and I sat frozen in my chair, the sting of her words echoing louder than the laughter around me. In that moment, it wasn't just that I was invisible. I was publicly diminished, my worth reduced to a footnote in Ethan's story. I forced a smile, but inside I felt something break. I had been told before that my art was nothing more than a pastime, but hearing it announced in front of a crowd of relatives was unbearable. It felt like every brushstroke I had ever painted, every late night spent perfecting my skills, had been dismissed in a single toast. I wanted to disappear under the table. That night, when the relatives finally left and the house grew quiet, I locked myself in my room. I pulled out my sketchbook and stared at the blank page, my hands trembling. For the first time, I wondered if they were right, if my art was worthless, if my life would always be overshadowed by Ethan's. But instead of closing the book, I picked up my pencil and started to draw. It was my silent rebellion, the only way I knew to prove to myself that even if no one else saw my value, I could not give up on it. After that Thanksgiving, I realized that waiting for my family's approval was a battle I would never win. The humiliation of being dismissed so casually in front of everyone still echoed in my mind, but it also pushed me to search for a place where I didn't need anyone's permission to exist. That place became my art. My bedroom turned into my sanctuary. While the rest of the house revolved around Ethan's successes, my little corner became a world of colors and sketches. Each evening, I would shut my door, open my sketchbook, and let the pencil glide across the paper. In those moments, the comparisons and the disappointment faded away. I could breathe. I could be me. The paper never asked why I wasn't like my brother. The paint never told me I would never be enough. It just accepted me. At school, I started spending more and more time in the art room. The smell of paint and the quiet scratch of brushes on canvas became comforting, like a language only I understood. My art teacher, Miss Thornton, noticed me lingering after class. One afternoon, she walked over and said, "Rhea, you see things differently." That's not something to hide. That's a gift. I remember blinking back tears, because it was one of the first times an adult had called what I did valuable. Her words were simple, but to me they were lifelines. With her encouragement, I entered competitions and joined the art club. My work began to win recognition, sometimes even awards, but the victories felt bittersweet. I longed to bring home a certificate and see my parents hang it on the wall, the same way they had lined Ethan's trophies across the living room. Instead, whenever I showed them my achievements, my father would glance for a second before turning back to talk about Ethan's grades. My watercolor that won first prize ended up tucked away in the back of my closet while Ethan's debate plaques gleamed under the living room lights. Still, I kept creating. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the walls no longer echoed with praise for Ethan, I would sit by my window with a sketchbook on my lap. I poured every ounce of frustration, every ache of invisibility into my drawings. Each page became a place where I mattered, even if no one else believed it. Looking back, I realized that art was more than a hobby. It was survival. It gave me a voice when I was silenced at the dinner table. It gave me pride when my family tried to strip it away. Most importantly, it gave me a glimpse of a future where I could stand on my own. Not as Ethan's sister, not as the disappointment, but as Rhea, someone with a vision and a purpose worth fighting for. High school graduations are supposed to be milestones, moments when families come together to celebrate years of effort and look forward to the future. For Ethan, it was exactly that. The summer he graduated, our backyard was transformed into a festival. My parents rented a huge white tent, set up tables filled with catered food, and invited every relative, neighbor, and even some of his teachers. There were speeches, laughter, and endless stories about Ethan's brilliance. My father stood in front of everyone and delivered a 20-minute speech about his bright future at an Ivy League school. Cameras flashed as Ethan shook hands with relatives who told him he would make the family proud for generations. I stood on the edge of the crowd, clapping when everyone else clapped, but inside I felt smaller with every cheer. It was like watching the world applaud while I faded further into the background. 4 years later, it was my turn. I had worked hard, built a portfolio that earned me a partial scholarship to the Art Institute of New York, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe this time things would be different. I wanted to believe my parents would be proud, that they would see I was finally carving my own path. But on the day of my graduation, there were no tents, no neighbors, no speeches. We went to a modest restaurant, just the four of us, and the entire dinner conversation revolved around Ethan's latest internship at a financial firm. I sat across from my parents, my diploma resting quietly in my bag, and listened as they praised him for his determination and intelligence. When I tried to mention my scholarship, my father frowned and said, "Art is a nice interest, Rhea, but it won't put food on the table." His words sliced through me more deeply than he could have known. In that moment, the contrast between us was impossible to ignore. Ethan's path was bathed in light, celebrated at every step, while mine was treated like a detour that didn't deserve attention. I remember pushing the food around my plate, fighting back tears, realizing that no matter what I accomplished, my parents would never see me the way they saw him. The pride I had felt in myself began to wither under their disapproval. That night, when I returned home, I pulled out the folder that held my acceptance letter and scholarship details. I stared at it for a long time, wondering why something that meant so much to me seemed meaningless to them. For the first time, I understood that waiting for their validation was hopeless. If I wanted to move forward, I would have to carry my own pride, even if they refused to share it. That realization hurt, but it also lit a spark inside me. I told myself that one day I would prove them wrong, not through words or arguments, but by building a life so undeniable they could no longer dismiss it. Graduation had shown me where I stood in their eyes, but it also marked the beginning of a promise I made to myself. I would keep walking my path, even if I had to walk it alone. Walking across the stage at my graduation had left me with more emptiness than pride. But when I received my acceptance letter to the Art Institute of New York, a different feeling took root inside me. For the first time, I felt like the path ahead was mine alone, not just a shadow trailing behind Ethan. I packed my bags with shaking hands, terrified but also excited. and boarded a bus bound for New York City. I remember staring out the window as the suburbs faded away, silently promising myself that this would be the chapter where I stopped waiting for approval and started creating a life of my own. The first weeks were overwhelming. The city was loud and fast, a constant rush that seemed to swallow me whole. At the Institute, I was surrounded by talent, students who spoke confidently about design theories and creative visions. I often sat in the back of the studio, afraid that if I opened my mouth, people would see me as the imposter I secretly believed I was. The voice of my parents still echoed in my mind, telling me art was just a hobby, telling me I would never make a living with it. But slowly, something began to change. My professors noticed the way I saw patterns others overlooked, the way I poured myself into every project. One afternoon, my design instructor stopped by my desk and studied my work. "You've got a rare perspective, Rhea," he said gently. "Don't hide it. This is why you're here." The words startled me. They were so different from the words I had grown up hearing. I held on to them tightly, replaying them in my mind whenever doubt threatened to pull me under. Living in New York wasn't easy. I worked part-time at a coffee shop to cover what my scholarship didn't, often staying up past midnight finishing assignments after long shifts on my feet. My hands smelled like espresso more often than they did of paint, and some nights I wanted to collapse into bed without touching my sketchbook. But then I would think of the promises I had made to myself, that I would prove them wrong, and I would keep going. Despite the exhaustion, there were moments of pure joy. My first group critique where my classmates actually admired my project, the thrill of seeing my design displayed in the student gallery, the late-night walks back to my dorm when the city lights felt like they belonged to me. For the first time, I wasn't Ethan's sister. I was just Rhea, an artist in her own right. Looking back, I know those early days didn't erase the scars of my childhood, but they gave me something I had never known before, a glimpse of possibility. College wasn't only about learning design. It was about learning that my voice mattered, even if my family refused to hear it. That realization was fragile, but it was enough to keep me moving forward, step by step, into a future I was determined to claim as my own. The longer I stayed in New York, the more I realized that following a dream meant carrying a heavy cost. The Art Institute was everything I had hoped for creatively, but financially it was a constant struggle. My scholarship covered part of the tuition, but there were still bills, rent, books, and supplies that seemed to drain my bank account faster than I could refill it. To keep myself afloat, I picked up extra shifts at the coffee shop, sometimes working until 2 in the morning before dragging myself back to my dorm. My classmates talked about internships and networking opportunities, while I calculated how many lattes I needed to make to pay for another set of paintbrushes. There were nights I wanted to quit. My body ached from exhaustion, my grades began to slip under the weight of my schedule, and the voice of my parents returned to haunt me. I could almost hear my father's words every time I felt myself faltering. "Art won't put food on the table." The cruel part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. Some weeks I skipped meals to stretch my money, living on instant noodles while Ethan sent photos home from expensive restaurants during his travels. It stung to know that even in my family's eyes, his life of privilege still counted more than my fight for independence. What made it worse was the silence from home. Phone calls with my parents rarely touched on me. They asked about Ethan's job interviews, Ethan's prospects, Ethan's future. When I tried to talk about my projects or the awards I had started to win at school, their voices grew flat, and the subject shifted quickly. I learned to stop mentioning my achievements altogether. Instead, I listened quietly, biting my tongue as they praised him for opportunities he often squandered. Still, I couldn't let go of my dream. Every sacrifice seemed worth it when I was alone with my work. I remember one winter night when the heat in my tiny apartment barely worked, and I wrapped myself in a blanket while sketching by the dim light of my desk lamp. My fingers were stiff with cold, but I kept drawing, because it was the only thing that reminded me I was alive. Those moments built a resilience I didn't know I had. There were small victories, too. A professor recommended me for a freelance job designing flyers for a local gallery. The pay was modest, but when I saw my design displayed in public for the first time, it felt like a triumph. I kept the check, not because of its value, but as proof that I could earn something real from my art. That check became a symbol, taped to the corner of my desk, reminding me why the sacrifices mattered. Those years were hard, lonelier than I had expected, but they carved strength into me. I learned that survival required persistence, and persistence was something I had in abundance. Even when the world doubted me, even when my family ignored me, I refused to give up. And in that refusal, I began to build a foundation that would later change everything. The small freelance project for the gallery was the turning point I didn't realize I had been waiting for. When I walked past the building and saw my flyer taped to the glass door, my chest swelled with a pride that no one could take away from me. It was more than a design on paper. It was proof that I had carved something tangible out of years of doubt and sacrifice. For the first time, I could look at my work and say to myself, "This matters." Word began to spread in small ways. A gallery owner recommended me to a friend who needed a website banner. That friend passed my name to another who needed a logo. None of the jobs paid much, but they were enough to cover my rent without begging for extra shifts at the cafe. Each email notification that popped up on my laptop felt like validation, as if the world was slowly starting to recognize the voice I had been fighting so hard to keep alive. One afternoon, while delivering a project to a client, I caught my reflection in the subway window. My clothes were still thrift store finds. My eyes still carried the shadows of too many sleepless nights. But there was something new in my posture. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. The girl who once sat at family dinners swallowing silence now had clients who trusted her vision. The daughter who was told her art was a hobby now had proof that it could put food on the table. Of course, the calls from home didn't change. My parents still asked about Ethan's prospects, how his job search was going after a failed venture, how he was coping after his divorce. I would mention a project I had finished or a small award I had received, and their voices stayed flat, uninterested, as though I were describing a passing distraction instead of a career. I stopped expecting them to cheer for me. Instead, I learned to celebrate my own victories, no matter how small. One night, after receiving my first paycheck from a corporate design job, I treated myself to a simple dinner at a diner near my apartment. Sitting alone with a plate of pancakes and coffee, I let the satisfaction wash over me. It wasn't about the money. It was about the independence, about proving to myself that I was capable of creating something sustainable. I thought back to all the nights I had worked until dawn, all the comments that told me I would never measure up, and realized that this moment was mine alone. The early successes did not erase the years of pain, but they gave me something I had never felt before: hope. Hope that I could step out of the shadow cast over me since childhood. Hope that one day my parents would see me as more than a disappointment. And most of all, hope that I could keep building a life that was truly mine. With each project completed, with each client satisfied, that hope grew stronger. And I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could rewrite the story that had always been written for me. Just when I was beginning to feel steady, when my work was finally bringing me both income and confidence, the calls from home started to change. At first, it was subtle. My mother would sigh heavily on the phone and mention how expensive my father's medications were becoming. My father would complain about the rising costs of maintaining the house. They never said the words outright, but the implication was clear. They wanted help. The first time they asked directly, I froze. I had barely enough to cover my own rent and supplies, yet my father said in a tone that carried more command than request, "Ria, You should contribute to the family. It's your duty. I wanted to remind him of the years he had told me my art was worthless, that I would never survive on it. But the word duty lodged itself in my chest. I thought of all the nights they had put food on the table when I was a child, of how hard they had worked to keep the house standing. Against my better judgment, I agreed to send a small amount each month. At first, it was $50, then $100, then $2. Each time I hesitated, my father would remind me how much Ethan was struggling, how the family had to come together to support him. That was the part that stung most. Even in my sacrifice, Ethan remained at the center. My contributions weren't about valuing me. They were about keeping him afloat. As my career grew, so did their requests. By the time I had built a small roster of regular clients, my parents expected hundreds from me each month. They spoke of it casually, as though it was nothing, as though I was an endless well they could draw from. When I tried to explain that I needed the money to invest in my business, my mother cut me off with, "Ethan had a real career once, Rhea. He lost so much. You can afford to share." The words left me silent, my throat tight with anger I didn't dare voice. I began to notice how different our realities were. I lived in a cramped studio apartment, saving every cent to upgrade my computer and buy software. Ethan, meanwhile, was still living at home, his expenses covered, his failures cushioned by the family I was now partially supporting. Yet he remained the favored son, the golden child in their eyes, while I was treated like a backup plan they had finally found useful. Each transfer I made filled me with resentment. It wasn't that I didn't want to help my parents. It was that I knew they never truly saw me. To them, I was a means to an end, the daughter they had once dismissed but now depended on without a trace of gratitude. I told myself it was temporary, that one day they would recognize the sacrifices I had made. Deep down, though, I feared they never would. That fear hardened into a quiet determination. If they could not value me as their daughter, then I would make sure the world valued me as an artist. What I didn't know then was that the pressure they placed on me, the money I sent each month, and the way it was used would soon unravel everything and bring the truth crashing into the open. The years of sending money home had become a routine I no longer questioned. Each month, like clockwork, I would transfer the amount my parents expected, telling myself that it was the right thing to do, that this was how I could finally prove my worth to them. It wasn't easy. There were months when I could barely pay my own rent or had to push aside dreams of upgrading my computer, but I never missed a payment. In my mind, I thought perhaps this sacrifice would finally tip the scale, that maybe one day they would see me as the daughter who gave without complaint. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a rainy Thursday night, and I had just come home from a long day at work. My body was tired, but I felt a sense of relief knowing I had finished a big project for a client. I poured myself a cup of tea and was settling into the couch when the phone rang. It was my father. His voice sounded heavier than usual, almost rehearsed, as though he had prepared himself for what he was about to say. He began with small talk about the weather, about how cold the winters were back home, but soon his words shifted. "Rhea," he said after a pause, "things have been getting harder here. The bills are piling up. Your mother's medication costs more now. The house needs repairs. We were wondering if you could send more each month. An extra $300 would make a big difference." My heart sank. $300 may not have sounded like much to them, but to me it was everything. It meant groceries, subway rides, supplies for my studio. It meant the fragile stability I had built for myself would once again be threatened. I sat in silence, the phone pressed to my ear, trying to process his words. After a moment, I asked quietly, "Is this for you and Mom, or is it for Ethan?" There was a pause, long enough for me to hear my own pulse in my ears. When he finally answered, his tone shifted, almost defensive. "What difference does it make, Rhea? We're family. We help each other. My throat tightened. He didn't deny it. He didn't say no. He simply dodged the question, and that told me everything I needed to know. The money I had been sending, the sacrifices I had been making, had been going into a void I couldn't see. And I began to realize that void had Ethan's name on it. I tried to steady my voice. Dad, I've been helping you for years. I've never missed a single month, even when it meant I couldn't afford things for myself. Meanwhile, Ethan has given what exactly? My father cleared his throat and muttered something about Ethan going through a hard time, about how he had lost so much after his divorce and needed the family support now more than ever. My mother's voice suddenly joined the line, softer but firm. He's your brother, Rhea. You know what he's been through. Can't you understand? I wanted to scream. For nearly a decade, I had been quietly draining my own strength to give to them, and not once had they asked if I was okay. Not once had they wondered how I was managing, or if I could afford to keep sending money. My struggles didn't matter because in their eyes, I was still the lesser child, the one who could endure without complaint, while Ethan's hardships, even self-inflicted, were treated like tragedies requiring the whole family to rally around him. The call ended with me promising nothing, my voice trembling as I said I would think about it. But as I set the phone down, a storm began to rise inside me. For the first time, anger outweighed guilt. I looked around my small apartment, the walls bare, the paint peeling in places, the secondhand furniture that barely filled the room, and I thought of Ethan living comfortably in the family home, shielded from reality. The imbalance was unbearable. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the words circling in my head. More money, more sacrifice, more silence about what it was really for. Something in me knew this couldn't go on. I had carried this burden for too long, and the cracks were beginning to show. What I didn't realize then was that this request, this simple demand for more, would be the first domino in a chain of revelations that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family. The request for more money lingered in my mind for days. I tried to focus on my projects, on the clients who were finally beginning to see my value. But every time I opened my laptop to work, my father's words echoed back. An extra 300 would make a big difference. It wasn't just the number that stung. It was the casual way he said it, as if my life and my sacrifices were limitless resources. The more I thought about it, the more I felt the pressure closing in on me. Eventually, I knew I couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. I had to call them back. When I dialed the number, my stomach churned. My mother answered, her voice calm, almost sweet, and for a moment I almost convinced myself I could explain gently. But as soon as the subject of money came up, her tone shifted. She reminded me of my father's health, of the bills piling up, of how Ethan was struggling after losing everything. I listened quietly, my jaw tightening, until my father's voice joined in on the other line. He didn't ease into it. He went straight for the wound. Rhea, you need to understand. Ethan had a real career, a real future. He fell from a great height. You can't compare what you do with what he lost. The words cut deeper than I expected. I had always been compared to Ethan, but hearing it laid out so bluntly after years of sacrifices they had never even acknowledged left me shaking with anger. My father's voice grew sharper. Your graphic arts thing, it's different. It's not the same as a real profession. You'll never be as good as your brother. Never. Something inside me snapped. My whole life I had swallowed their words, buried my hurt, and worked harder hoping one day I would prove them wrong. But in that moment, the anger that had been building for years finally erupted. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, and I spoke with a steadiness that surprised even me. Then ask him to pay all the bills. I'm not sending money anymore. Silence followed. For a second, I thought maybe they hadn't heard me. Then I heard my mother gasp. Her voice trembled as she asked, "What money?" Confusion surged through me. "What are you talking about?" I said. She repeated herself, slower this time. "We never received a single dollar from you." The room around me seemed to spin. 8 years of transfers, 8 years of sacrifices, 8 years of believing I was carrying their burden. I felt my pulse hammering in my temples. "That's not possible," I whispered. "I've been sending you money every single month. 500 at first, then 800, for 8 years." On the other end of the line, there was a heavy silence. I could hear the faint murmur of my parents conferring, their voices low and uncertain. My father finally spoke, his tone uneasy. "Ria, we never received any regular payments. There was that one time after my surgery, but nothing monthly. Are you sure you didn't make a mistake?" My chest tightened as dread settled over me. Mistake? How could 8 years of transfers be a mistake? I opened my banking app with trembling hands and scrolled through the long list of payments. There they were, line after line of transfers to the account number I had written down years ago. The realization hit me like a physical blow. There was only one person who could have rerouted those payments. One person who had access. One person who had always been held above me. I didn't say anything more. My voice would have betrayed the storm raging inside me. I simply told them I had to go and hung up. The phone slipped from my hand onto the couch, and I sat there frozen, staring at the evidence glowing back at me from the screen. All the years I had believed I was finally being a good daughter. All the years I thought I was carrying the family with my hard work, and none of it had reached them. My breaths came in shallow gasps as the truth settled in. Ethan. It had always been Ethan. When I ended the call that night, my body felt numb. My hands still clutched the phone, but my mind was spinning so fast I could barely breathe. I sat frozen on the couch, staring at the dim glow of my banking app, watching the endless trail of transactions that had drained me for nearly a decade. Each one of those transfers had been made with hope, with the belief that I was finally doing something that proved I was a good daughter. And now, with just a few words from my mother, the foundation of that belief cracked wide open. I forced myself to scroll slower, line by line, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. 8 years of payments, each one labeled carefully, each one sent to the same account number. I could remember when I first set it up. Ethan had been there, helping me write it down, assuring me that it was the joint account my parents used. I had been so eager to show I could contribute that I never questioned him. The realization was like ice water pouring down my spine. My breath quickened as pieces began to connect. The new clothes Ethan wore despite claiming to be broke, the vacations he somehow managed even after losing his job, the smug way he talked about being taken care of. I had noticed these things over the years but brushed them aside, convincing myself there must be explanations. Now, every memory snapped into place with sickening clarity. The money I thought had gone to pay for my father's medication or to fix the roof of the house had instead gone straight into my brother's pockets. I stood up, pacing the small apartment, my heart pounding against my ribs. Anger surged through me so fiercely that my hands trembled. How could he do this? How could he take from me month after month, watching me work myself to exhaustion, knowing I was living on noodles while he sat comfortably at home? And how could my parents, who praised him endlessly, not realize where their comfort was really coming from? The more I thought about it, the deeper the betrayal cut. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust. It was about the years I had believed that maybe, in some quiet way, My parents were finally seeing my worth through the support I gave. Every sacrifice I made had been tied to the hope that their opinion of me might change, that one day they would look at me with the same pride they gave Ethan. And now I knew none of it had reached them. To them, I was still invisible, still the daughter who could never measure up. I sat back down and opened my laptop, determined to gather everything. I pulled bank statements, highlighted transactions, printed copies of transfers. Page after page piled up on my desk, each one proof of what had been stolen from me. The stack grew thicker until it felt heavy in my hands, not just with paper, but with the weight of all the years I had been deceived. When exhaustion finally overtook me, I collapsed onto the couch, clutching the folder of documents to my chest like armor. I didn't cry. The anger was too sharp for tears. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. How long had Ethan planned this? Did my parents truly have no idea? And what would happen when I confronted them with the truth? As dawn crept through the blinds, painting pale lines across the room, I knew one thing for certain. The illusion I had lived under for so many years was gone. My brother had betrayed me in a way I could never have imagined, and my parents had unknowingly enabled it by placing blind faith in him. My world had shifted overnight, and there was no going back. For 2 days, I barely slept. The folder of documents sat on my desk like a weight I couldn't move, every page screaming a truth I wasn't ready to face. I kept going back to the same thought. Maybe there was some kind of mistake. Maybe the bank had misfiled something. Maybe Ethan had misunderstood. Deep down, I already knew the truth, but admitting it out loud felt like stepping off a cliff. Then, unexpectedly, confirmation came from a place I didn't anticipate. It was a Sunday afternoon when my cousin Sophia added me to a group chat with several family members. They were planning a birthday gathering for my grandmother Margaret, and as usual, the conversation revolved around who would bring what dish and what time everyone should arrive. I was scrolling through the messages absent-mindedly when Sophia typed something that made my heart stop. "Ethan, you better save some of that allowance Rhea sends you so you can buy Grandma a nice gift this year." The room spun. My hands went cold. I reread the message again and again, the words blurring on the screen. Allowance. She had said it so casually, like it was a joke the whole family already knew, like my sacrifices had been some kind of open secret. Within seconds, Ethan replied with a laughing emoji and a comment about how he always knew how to spend wisely. No denial, no shame, just arrogance. I sat there staring at the screen, my chest tightening as a wave of humiliation washed over me. Not only had Ethan stolen from me, he had boasted about it, turning my pain into a family punchline. I could almost hear their laughter in my head, the same laughter that had once erupted at holiday dinners when Ethan was praised and I was forgotten. Except this time, it wasn't just about favoritism. This time, it was theft, betrayal, deceit on a level that left me trembling. Anger coursed through me so powerfully I had to set my phone down to keep from throwing it across the room. All the years I had believed I was silently proving my worth. All the meals I had skipped. All the nights I had worked myself sick. It had all been a lie. My parents hadn't thanked me because they had never received a dime. Ethan had taken it all, pocketed it, and laughed about it with the very people who had always treated him like royalty. That night, I made a decision. I pulled the folder of documents closer and began to organize them meticulously. Bank transfers, account numbers, email confirmations. I created timelines, highlighted patterns, and prepared everything like I was building a case. Because in truth, that's what I was doing. This wasn't just a sibling rivalry anymore. This was fraud, deception, and betrayal, and I wasn't going to let it continue. Still, a part of me hesitated. What would my parents say when I showed them the evidence? Would they finally believe me? Or would they defend Ethan as they always had? That uncertainty cut as deep as the betrayal itself. But the more I thought about Sophia's careless message, the more I realized there was no turning back. The truth was already in the open, and I had the proof to make it undeniable. When I finally zipped the folder shut, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in years, the power was in my hands. Ethan had stolen my money, but he hadn't stolen my determination. I was no longer the invisible daughter who quietly endured. I was a woman ready to confront the lies that had shaped my life. And when the confrontation came, I knew it would shatter the illusion of our family forever. The folder of documents felt heavier in my hands than it had any right to. Each page carried not only numbers and dates, but years of sacrifice, betrayal, and silence. I knew I couldn't delay any longer. My parents deserved to see the truth, even if they weren't ready to accept it. So one Saturday morning, I boarded a train back to my hometown, the folder tucked securely in my bag, my chest tight with the weight of what was about to happen. When I arrived at the house, the familiar scent of my mother's cooking drifted through the air. For a moment, I almost felt like a child again, except the heaviness in my stomach reminded me this visit was nothing like the others. My parents welcomed me with smiles, asking about work and whether I had eaten. Their voices full of casual warmth that only made my chest ache more. I sat down at the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and pulled the folder from my bag. "I need to show you something," I began, my voice steady but soft. My father's brow furrowed as he adjusted his glasses. My mother leaned closer. Her curiosity piqued. I opened the folder and spread the statements across the table, each one carefully highlighted. For the past 8 years, I've been sending money every month. 500 at first, then 800. I believed it was going to you. But you said you never received any of it. Look at these transfers. Look at the account number. For a long moment, they were silent. My mother picked up one of the pages, scanning the lines, her lips tightening. My father's eyes darted across the statements, then back to me. "Ria?" he said finally, his tone measured. "This doesn't prove what you think it does. Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe the bank misfiled something." The dismissal was like a punch to the chest. After everything, after the sleepless nights and skipped meals, after years of being invisible, they were still ready to believe I was wrong rather than consider that Ethan could be at fault. My voice rose despite my effort to stay calm. A mistake? For 8 years? Every month on time, to the same account number Ethan gave me? How can you look at this and call it a mistake? My mother shook her head, her eyes glistening with unease. Ethan wouldn't do that. He's been struggling. You know how hard it's been for him. Why would he take money from you? Her words cut deeper than I expected. Even with the evidence laid out in front of them, their instinct was to protect him. I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes, but I forced myself to hold her gaze. Because he could. Because you always believed in him no matter what. Because you never thought to believe in me. The room fell into a heavy silence. My father's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the table as if steadying himself. My mother looked away, her shoulders trembling slightly. For the first time, I saw something flicker across their faces. Doubt, fear, maybe even guilt. But they said nothing. The silence spoke louder than any denial could. I gathered the papers back into the folder, my hands shaking, but my voice steadied with every word. I've carried this family in ways you never saw. I worked myself sick to send you money, believing I was finally doing something that mattered. But it never reached you. It went to Ethan, and you defended him even now. I won't do it anymore. I won't be invisible anymore. As I zipped the folder shut, the air in the kitchen felt colder, heavier. My parents didn't argue further, but they didn't apologize either. Their silence was its own kind of betrayal. Yet, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel powerless in that silence. I had spoken my truth, laid the evidence before them, and refused to shrink back into the shadows. Whatever came next, the illusion was gone, and the ground beneath our family had begun to shift. I left the kitchen table with my folder clutched tightly in my hands and walked straight into the living room where Ethan was lounging on the couch. He barely looked up from his phone when I entered, his usual air of confidence written all over his face. For a second, I just stood there, watching him, trying to understand how someone who had taken so much from me could sit there so casually, as if nothing had happened. The anger that had been simmering inside me since that phone call erupted into resolve. This was the moment. "Ethan," I said sharply. His head snapped up, his smile fading when he saw the papers in my hand. "We need to talk." He leaned back, his voice calm but guarded. "About what?" I dropped the folder onto the coffee table and spread out the statements, page after page of transfers, each one carrying my sacrifice in black and white. About this. About the 8 years of money I thought I was sending to Mom and Dad. The money that never reached them. The money that ended up in your account. His expression flickered for just a moment, a quick flash of panic that he tried to cover with a laugh. "You must be mistaken. Maybe you sent it to the wrong account. These things happen." I stepped closer, my voice steady but my hands trembling with rage. "Don't lie to me. You gave me that account number. You told me it was theirs, and you sat back while I worked myself to exhaustion, believing I was helping them. All this time, you let me carry the burden while you lived off what I earned." Ethan's jaw tightened, his mask of confidence beginning to crack. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice rising. "I needed that money. I had real responsibilities, real pressures. After my divorce, after I lost my job, what was I supposed to do? You wouldn't understand what it's like to fall from the top." His words burned through me like fire. I took another step toward him, my eyes locked on his. "You're right. I wouldn't understand because I was never given the chance to fall from the top. I started at the bottom, scraping by, working 2 jobs, living in an apartment where the heat barely worked. And even then, I sent money home every month, believing I was helping our parents. Meanwhile, you stole from me and laughed about it. You turned my sacrifices into your safety net." The room had grown tense and quiet. My parents stood in the doorway, their faces pale, caught between disbelief and dawning realization. For years they had defended him, but now the evidence was undeniable. Ethan's silence said more than his excuses ever could. I picked up the top page from the stack and held it out to him. "You signed for this account. Your name is right here. You can't talk your way out of it. Admit what you did." He stared at the paper, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Finally, with his voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Fine. I took it. I needed it more than you did. You always had your art, your little successes. You didn't need the money like I did." The admission hung heavy in the air. My mother gasped, covering her mouth, while my father shook his head, unable to speak. For the first time in my life, the golden child had no shield, no excuses left to hide behind. I gathered the papers back into the folder, my voice clear and unshaken. "You didn't just take my money, Ethan. You took my trust, my sacrifices, my chance to finally feel like I mattered in this family. And I will never let you do it again." The silence that followed was unlike any we had ever known. For once, Ethan had no applause, no defense, no one rushing to protect him. He was exposed, and the truth lay bare before all of us. The moment Ethan admitted the truth, the room seemed to shift. For as long as I could remember, he had been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one everyone praised without hesitation. But now, with his own words, that image cracked. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother's hand trembled as she lowered it from her mouth, her eyes fixed on Ethan with something I had never seen before. Not pride or adoration, but shock. My father's shoulders sagged as if the weight of years of denial had finally settled on him. Ethan tried to regain his composure, straightening his back as though he could somehow restore the dignity he had lost. "I told you," he muttered, his tone defensive. "I needed it. What was I supposed to do? Let myself drown? I'm your son. Family is supposed to help each other." His words rang hollow. Even he seemed to realize it as his gaze flickered away from mine. My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Ethan, your sister nearly destroyed herself working to send that money. She believed she was supporting us. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The disappointment in his tone was heavy, and for the first time I saw Ethan flinch under our father's words. My mother shook her head slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "All these years, we thought Rhea didn't care, that she chose her own life over family. And all along, she was the one holding us up." The weight of her words hit me hard. Part of me wanted to break down, to cry at the validation I had waited for all my life. But another part of me felt hollow, because it had taken undeniable proof, years of sacrifice, and Ethan's own confession for them to see what had been in front of them all along. As the truth spread through the family, the collapse of Ethan's image became undeniable. Word traveled fast after Sophia's careless message in the group chat. Relatives who had once toasted him at Thanksgiving or showered him with praise now looked at him differently. The whispers began, quiet but sharp, about how he had lived off my hard work, about how the golden child had stolen from his own sister. Even my grandmother Margaret, who had always held him above everyone else, sat in stunned silence when I showed her the statements. Her eyes narrowed, and for once she had no words to defend him. At the next family gathering, the shift was palpable. Ethan sat at the table, but the admiration that once surrounded him was gone. Conversations no longer orbited around his achievements. In fact, no one asked him about his life at all. Instead, relatives approached me quietly, some with apologies, others with words of encouragement. "We had no idea, Rhea," one uncle whispered. "You were stronger than all of us realized." Ethan's face darkened with every passing moment, the shame settling over him like a shadow he could not escape. For years, he had basked in the light of being the chosen one, and now that light had been extinguished. He tried to joke, to brush it off, but the laughter never came. The silence that met his words was louder than any rebuke. Watching it unfold was surreal. I had spent my life believing I would always be second to him, invisible in his shadow. Now, for the first time, the roles had reversed. He was the one being ignored, dismissed, forgotten. And me? I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't the lesser child or the afterthought. I was the one who had endured, who had sacrificed, and who had finally been seen for the truth of what I was. The collapse of Ethan's image didn't heal all the wounds he and my parents had caused, but it did something I never thought possible. It shifted the balance. It forced everyone to see the truth, even if it was painful. And for the first time in my life, the golden child was no longer untouchable. In the weeks after the truth came out, I felt as if the air around me had changed. For the first time, I walked into my parents' house without carrying the invisible weight of comparison on my shoulders. The silence that used to suffocate me during family dinners no longer belonged to me. It hung over Ethan instead, a silence heavy with disappointment and shame. He avoided my eyes, and for once I didn't feel the need to lower mine. But even as the power shifted, I knew I couldn't let myself be pulled back into the same cycle. The temptation to forgive too quickly, to resume old patterns, was strong. My parents tried to act as though life could return to normal, as though we could sweep the betrayal under the rug, but I refused to let it happen. I had spent too many years sacrificing myself for their approval, and now I understood something I should have known long ago. Their recognition was not what defined me. My worth was never theirs to give. One evening, as we sat around the table in that same kitchen where so many of my wounds had been carved, I spoke the words I had carried for weeks. My voice was steady, calm, but unyielding. I won't be sending money anymore. I've done more than my share, and I will not carry Ethan's mistakes on my back. If you need help in the future, I'll decide on my own terms, but I won't be manipulated again. My mother's eyes welled with tears, and my father opened his mouth as if to argue, but I raised my hand gently and shook my head. This is not up for debate. I love you both, but love doesn't mean I allow myself to be used. For years, you saw me as less, and when I gave everything, you didn't even know it was me. That ends now. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to make me feel small. But this time, the silence was mine. It was the silence of setting boundaries, of reclaiming my voice. For the first time, I felt like I had drawn a line in the sand and dared them to cross it. They didn't. My father's shoulders slumped, and my mother nodded slowly, her tears slipping down her cheeks. Walking out of that house that night, I felt lighter. The scars of my childhood would always remain, but they no longer controlled me. I thought of the girl I had once been, sitting at the dinner table, swallowing her words, believing she was invisible. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her, one day you will stand tall. One day you will be heard. Back in my apartment, I looked around at the life I had built for myself. The art hanging on my walls, the laptop on my desk, the steady stream of projects lined up for the coming months. None of it had come from their approval or Ethan's shadow. It had come from me. From the nights I stayed up drawing when the world told me it was useless. From the sacrifices I made when no one was watching. I realized then that my revenge wasn't in humiliating Ethan or even in exposing the truth. My revenge was in living well, in proving that I could build a life of meaning and strength without their constant validation. I knew there would still be challenges ahead. Families don't transform overnight, and forgiveness doesn't erase years of pain. But I also knew I had changed. I had found my voice, and I would never give it up again. The boundaries I set were not walls to keep love out, but doors that opened only to respect, honesty, and truth. And as I picked up my sketchbook and let the pencil dance across the page, I finally felt free. The golden child had fallen, the silence had broken, and in the wreckage of all those years, I had discovered something far greater than revenge. I had discovered myself. So that's my story. For years, I believed I would never be enough, that no matter what I did, I would always stand in Ethan's shadow. But the truth is, I didn't need to outshine him to prove my worth. I only needed to stop giving away my power and start living for myself. If you've ever been told you'll never measure up, remember this. Your value isn't decided by your parents, your siblings, or anyone else who tries to define you. Your value comes from the life you build, the choices you make, and the courage you find to stand in your own truth. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If my story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story too. Together, we can remind each other that the best revenge isn't about tearing someone else down. It's about rising, healing, and living well on our own terms.